Alex Ostberg, welcome back to the Running Effect podcast. I normally don't check the number of episodes we're on, but a few weeks ago I had my editor go through manually and count every single one. He probably hates me for asking him to do that. This is episode 474. So you've made it 473 episodes after the first edition that we've done with each other. And this one's a special one. I don't think we've ever done something like this, which was part of the reason why I wanted to do it, where it's kind of a year in review recap of the Running Effect, as well as you and I pulling the best learnings and insights, the three best learnings and insights individually that we came away from this year, and kind of a process for both you and I to distill the knowledge we hopefully gained into a practical platform like this, and hopefully people can find value from that. So anyways, Alex, a privilege to do the final episode of 2024 with you. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. No, I appreciate you having me on. It's always a pleasure to be here. I do think at the end of the year, it definitely is a reflective time of year. And I think both of us were exchanging texts about how we were trying to go through the process of an annual review. And I thought it was a neat concept to try to tie in some of the insights and learnings and some of the personal experiences that we've accumulated over this past year, and then try to consolidate that into a podcast. I think the reality is at the end of the year, you you have by definition accumulated a lot more new experiences, but you don't learn through experience alone. You learn through reflecting on that experience. And so I think this is a great opportunity. It forces us to kind of neatly package up and put a bow on some of the lessons that we've learned, and then also kind of hopefully help the audience a little bit with some of the things that we're working through, and will hopefully be good guidance for the year ahead.
Yeah, I think going into 2024, one of the things I actually did poorly last year was not reflecting on my 2023. And so I think I got early part into January feeling like really off because I don't think I properly reflected on 2023, which on paper totally should have, because it was a crazy year, as you and I'm sure a lot of other people know about. And also just you can't really set direction without reflection. And so I think I also got mid January and was just like, oh, what are my goals? What are the tangible practical steps I can take towards those goals? I don't even have, like, I had goals in my head, but putting it down on paper and like chronicling a journey and path to get to those goals is a whole different ball game. So this year is the first year I like actually sat down and had a full on reflective process. I've got like a 10-page document going. I feel like you. And that makes me really excited because I think I properly like not just got thoughts I had on paper, but also new thoughts from that experience, as well as through that process being able to write down and like think about the things I want to accomplish next year, both from a business perspective and from a personal perspective. But before I get into the lessons and learnings of this year, and this will tie into work because work is a big part of who I am, but wanted to do a little bit of like a recap of TRE, and I'll let you ask some of the questions here, anything that you're curious about. But I guess my first point off the top of my head, that's relevant for today's conversation. We're recording this on December 30th. Also, going back one second, if you're listening to this and haven't done an end of year recap, it can take 30 minutes. So if you haven't done it, take 30 minutes today and do it. Anyways, today, December 30th. Last time I recorded a podcast was, I want to say, December 17th. So 13-day break. Alex, I think that's the longest break I've taken for sure since going full time, but maybe in like 2 or 3 years of doing the podcast, which is crazy. So if I'm rusty today, that's why.
That's no problem, man. I'm sure you're a little bit antsy to get back to work, right? Like your day-to-day experience is probably so defined by like trying to find guests, recording episodes, that it's probably a foreign feeling for you to take a step back and not have any
Yes.
podcasts on your schedule.
I honestly like this is such a strong, this is maybe too strong, but I low key felt like purposeless back back home, at least for a little bit. I was just like it was like you get to the middle of the day and I would totally feel like chomping at the bit to record a podcast or reach out to a guest or something of the like. But it's one of the things I'm really trying to work more intently on, is like taking intentional breaks. And maybe you can share some words here because we were texting about this yesterday. But I just love my work so much that I find it so hard to even like take a full day off, or when I'm with family, like be fully present with them, because I love my work. I love what I do. And the reality is, when you own your own thing, you're responsible for its success or its failure. And because I'm aware of that mindset, I feel like more is more, because it is. And so this year was actually a really good, I think, step in the right direction for me, of being able to show myself that I have the discipline to like completely step back. And also I definitely needed it, like such a crazy few months of travel. And that's really why I implemented that kind of first break in like 2, 3 years. But also at the same time, it's that fine balance of like, I don't know, I love my work and I don't feel like I need a proper time off like most people do. I don't want that.
Right. Yeah, no, I think we were kind of going back and forth and saying that I don't think either of us are very vacation driven people. And I think the reality is that if you live for the weekend or if you live for your next vacation, it's probably it's probably a subtle way of your life telling you that you're not very happy with your day-to-day existence or you're not really enjoying what you're doing. So I feel very grateful that I don't feel like I need vacations to justify the challenges that I go through on a day-to-day basis. I find those problems engaging and I find them fun. And to me, like even when I'm on vacation, I mean, I've had bosses in the past be like, please take a break, log off. And like sometimes like I just need to take the point, like I need to like, take the hint and log off and actually try to zone out. But that's not where my mind goes at default. And I think part of that is I'm lucky that I've been able to find something that feels that engaging and it feels like something that I don't want to stop working on. So I completely agree. All right, so I think switching gears, one thing that we said we wanted to do was just recap for the audience kind of what you've gone through over the course of the past year in terms of being the leader behind the running effect and really growing this company into something that's become very prominent in the running space. And I always think that it's at least fun from my perspective to I have some unique insight to kind of understand how the sausage is made, right? Like get to peek behind the curtain and get to pick your brain in terms of how you kind of view your vision for the future and how you're thinking about your goals and aspirations. So we'll do a quick recap and then we'll transition into a little bit of our annual review. The first question that comes to mind for me is what's the best story that came from the podcast in 2024?
Great question. So many different fun stories that could be many podcasts in and of themselves. But actually, in relation to you, because he was one of your athletes, as well as just one of my favorite episodes that I did this past year was with Evan Jagger. Amazing episode. Highly recommend it for anyone who hasn't listened to it. But to give some context and history to the story I'm about to share, growing up, the media in the sport was really just flow track, and they would do these series called Driven, where they would take an athlete and they would do like a little bit of a documentary. This was before I even really tangibly cared about the sport of running. I was just like, the seeds were planted that I kind of cared about it and started like looking out these things. And I think FlowTrack had posted this on YouTube, so you didn't need a membership. They did a Driven with Evan Jagger, and in that Driven, he shares the story of his dad with the Mustang, which for those who aren't familiar, and we chronicled this in my conversation with Evan, his dad basically, when Evan was getting into the sport, said, if you break 5 minutes in the mile, I'll buy you like a 5.0 Mustang, whatever specific year. And that's what really got Evan to train and be dedicated, which ultimately led on to a remarkable Olympic long, crazy career, one of the best in U.S. history. Ended up getting the Mustang, ended up breaking 5 minutes in the mile. Anyways, present day. So I have Evan on the podcast. He's telling me all these wild updates I didn't expect to hear, like he moved to Sweden and the whole 9 yards. Listen to the podcast if you don't know these things. With that, I was like, oh, what's the deal with the Mustang? And he says, oh, it's in my dad's garage and we're actually looking to sell it. So part of me died because I was like, man, like in like fifth, sixth grade, I like this was the coolest story ever at the time for me. And I thought, because at that time I thought breaking 5 minutes in the mile would have been like the pinnacle in middle school. So really cool story to me. And so I just jokingly, like those who know me or spend any time with me on a day-to-day level, like I'm definitely a serious person and have a ton of depth, but also like I'm joking, lighthearted. Like, I don't know. I'd like to think of myself as somewhat humorous. So egging this on, I was like, yeah, if anyone's listening, like send in the $1 million offer, like Evan and I will vet it essentially. So then after the podcast, some guy DMs me and he says, good afternoon, Dominic. I've been listening to your pod for a little while and I just listened to your convo with Evan Jagger. Love the convo and how honest people feel when they speak with you. I'm reaching out about the small possibility I could get in contact with someone about the car. Here's my story. My father went out and bought an 88 5.0 when I was born with a plan to give it to me when I was able to drive. The greatest car for a 15-year-old. My father passed while I was competing at the USATF Young Man 17 to 18 regional championships in the decathlon. He is the reason I got into track. That day was obviously rough, but probably the reason why I chose to become a collegiate track coach in year 16. Anyways, I went to college and my mom put it in storage. Unbeknownst to me, she was struggling financially and missed enough payments to lose the storage locker. I've been looking for a 5.0 since then. Now that I have my own kids, I think about that car often. So that was in November, and on Friday, sent me a picture, him and Evan. Evan ended up selling the car to this guy. It was the most full circle moment. Long before I even knew podcasts existed, thought this story was the coolest thing that Evan had this car because he broke 5 minutes in the mile. And then to have my podcast be kind of like the middleman for one, the selling and passing on of the car, but also as that story I read, like no one else deserves this car. This is the coolest. It's not just like some car fanatic. It's like a lovely story within track and field about a car. I think I was like, I wasn't emotional, but I was like, that is one of the coolest things that has ever come from the podcast. And like such a full circle moment from me loving that origin story of Evan to then joking about it with him on the podcast about selling it. And then my podcast being the reason that it got sold and passed on. So I know it's a long story, but
That
crazy.
No, that's phenomenal. I mean, I think both you and I have talked about over the past few years. Sometimes when you work in the space and you're working in media or just communications, it can sometimes feel like you're just sending, messages out into the ether, and you don't always realize like what's getting traction and what's kind of being reflected back at you. But to then see this example of such a tangible impact that it had on somebody's life, and you're getting to close the loop with a picture of one of your previous idols and someone who has obviously benefited from the story, that must be such a heartwarming moment. So, and I know that, you occasionally will get letters and DMs and comments, but like that might be the single greatest story that I've heard from in that vein. So that's phenomenal.
Super, super
Um,
cool.
wow. Well, I don't know if I could follow it up with many other questions that can elicit better stories than that. But I think one thing that I always think about is sometimes we get so entrenched in our like day-to-day existence that we don't always zoom out and look at kind of the 30,000 foot view of the landscape. And I think a lot of times what I'll try to do is like a little bit of mental time travel, and I'll say, okay, like let me envision myself in 10 years time and then look back on where I was at this point in time. And like, are there any lessons that become more obvious when you actually zoom out a bit? And my question for you is, if you were to think about yourself in 2035 or 2034, and you look back on this period of time in your life, you look back at the maturity of where the company is and how it's growing, what do you think 2024 will represent in terms of what it did for the company and how it kind of set the trajectory moving forward into the future? What is the defining element of this year if you look back, if you look at it from that
You can have
perspective?
my job, Alex. What a question right there. What a question. Yeah, I would say it is in reflection. It's the year that it went from a podcast to a full on business. 2023 was, I think, probably the most special year in the company's history, just in terms of it went from really nothing to a full time job by the end of it. And I would have never really seen that reality. Whereas going into 2024, I had full knowledge that by the end of it, I was still going to have a full time job and hopefully we'll have grown it. I think this year, looking back, if we go 2034, 2035, and we come back to 2024 and we ask that question, I think it's the year that it like became a full on business. And even in our conversations that we have with each other on the phone, when we talk about business updates, I think a lot of those updates are around like ways in which we can accelerate its path, its growth, get into different avenues. My conversations with you about the contractors I'm having, starting to have discussions on like whether I should bring in a full-time employee or not, all those sorts of things I think elicit the thought of, oh, okay, this is like, it was a business before, like it's been a registered LLC for like over 2 years now, but like it's kind of becoming like a full-on operation. And one of the thoughts that I don't know if I've shared with you, but I've definitely shared with other people in terms of like one of the biggest learnings from the business in 2024 for me is the problems have gotten so much bigger. But as the problems get bigger, you become equally equipped to handle those problems. So everything gets more difficult, but you become a better version through solving those problems that you then are able to solve bigger and bigger problems. And it's kind of like this never ending game. So I would say this year had the biggest problems we've ever had, but I'm just a better version of myself because I've solved all the problems before it that I was able to handle those problems adequately. So I'd say keeping this answer somewhat short for me at least. 2024 was the year that like we actually started to turn things into a legitimate business. And there's parts of me that love it, parts of me that hate it. Like I think as humans, we crave a little bit of not having responsibility. And now that there's like so much and like people I'm paying more consistently and like money coming in, money coming out, like actually very calculated business decisions for the first time. Yeah, I mean, it's like, oh, there's no going back on this, which I kind of love. But also, I think like the nerves and like you listen to the type of podcast we send back and forth about like founders and early years in their company. I'm like, oh, I can kind of start to feel some of that like pressure, but in a good way because I think pressure elicits like action and if I didn't feel any pressure or any nerves or I could sit on the couch all day and not feel bad about it. So 2024 was the year that, yeah, we started to become like a full on business. And I started to see the path towards. A year ago, I think I would have said, oh, yeah, I think we'll be a 7-figure company eventually. I think this is the year that I'm like, we will be a 7-figure company and it's only a matter of time. So, and granted, like, I'll be fully transparent for this podcast. For if you made it 15 minutes in, congrats. I'll give you the gift of knowledge here. Like, I think our overall revenue is like a little over 200K. So, we're still quite a ways away from um, 7 figures. But even you go back 2 years ago, I think I made $400 in revenue, and then last year was a little over 100,000. This year was a little over 200,000, and I think every year we can at least double revenue. So I think we're only a few years away from being a 7-figure company. And I was doing this calculation for my year end post for Instagram, like $400 to like $200,000. It's like 50,000% increase. So it's crazy. It's wild.
It's pretty good. You're reaching the inflection point, right? Where that curve is going to get steeper and steeper and keep accelerating, which is pretty awesome. Um, I think staying in the vein of the idea of time travel and looking into the future, um, I love this idea that a lot of times, if you look back at history, a lot of the biggest stories, a lot of the biggest happenings, the biggest events that really move the needle on how you know human progress is made are oftentimes stories that are kind of secrets that are lying there in plain sight that aren't really discovered, and then when they're discovered, like explosive things happen, right? So like the biggest stories in the next 5 to 10 years are probably things that almost nobody is talking about, or if they are talking about them, there are people who have seen them and then like haven't yet really brought them into reality. And I mean, if you think back, like even if you look at in 2019, right, unless you're an infectious disease specialist studying the transmission from animals to humans of COVID-19, like maybe you were concerned that there was something like this that was on the brink of happening, but like the entire world was oblivious to the fact that we were about to face a transformational event that was going to completely alter the course of history, and that was unknown at the time. And when I kind of, I mean, you're very you're working very closely in the space of storytelling in the sport, and you're kind of assessing the long-term trends of where the sport is going. And part of me wants to ask you, like, what do you think are the biggest trends and the biggest stories in the sport right now that nobody's talking about? Like, what is this landscape going to look like in the future? And how are you going to try to position your company and your expertise to try to leverage some of that moving forward?
Yeah, another amazing question. Off the top of my head, first one was the SEC, at least for now, roster limit, or just NCAA roster limits. I think will have transformative impacts. And for those listening to this, a little sneak peek there. He's the coach at Liberty, but he's leading the basically opposing side and proposing it to Congress of basically the people who are like roster cuts are going to ruin the sport. He has to come on the podcast, so I'm excited for that conversation because it'll be cool to have someone who, if you're presenting stuff to Congress, you're probably so well thought through. And I think that'll make for a really interesting conversation. But that storyline, I think, will fundamentally affect, I think it'll kill walk ons, which will be interesting because a lot of my favorite podcasts have been with the walk on story. And it's the underdog story every human relates to. So I think that'll be interesting to follow, as well as just like how teams are structured within the NCAA and how a high schooler views whether they can run D1 or not, will be fundamentally altered by that story piece. So that's one story. I think another story is the amount of athletes who are realizing the positive impacts of social media in terms of like marketing themselves. I haven't listened to any of the episodes, but I know Rye Benjamin, Noah Lyles, and Grant Holloway just started a podcast with each other, and they got like Mr. Beast on the second episode. So one, crazy, but two, I don't know how much of it's actually about running. I haven't listened to it yet. But like things like that, we would not have seen 5 years ago. You wouldn't have seen Usain Bolt start a podcast. And I think these athletes are, one, realizing that they can connect with audience and fans in a deeper way than ever before. But also from a business perspective, like if this podcast does extraordinarily well, no, the three athletes have way more negotiating power with these companies because if they can reach more people, well, they can represent their brand to more people. And because of that, they become more valuable. So the price goes up. And like, well, honestly, one of my biggest regret is not the right word, but sometimes I feel uncomfortable knowing that I make significant, like I'll go to an event with a company and, I get paid X amount of dollars and I'm like, wow, this is like a close percentage to what like the lowest level athlete at this company is making. And I was there for 5 days. What like this? And that's crazy, but it's like the reality of the sport. These companies have way more bigger marketing budgets than they do signing athletes. And the unfortunate reality is that our sport just does not pay our professional athletes well at all. So I think another landscape that will be interesting to follow is just the amount of athletes who are going to start getting on social media more. Even another good example is like Jakob Ingebrigtsen doing the documentary with Amazon Prime. Like that's pretty rare that people would open up themselves to that much media, and I think it's just becoming more and more common, which I think overall is a very net positive um, for the sport. And then let me think other things in other storylines. I don't know. I think just like off the top of my head, I've texted you about this, and I know it's a little off the beaten path, but like what I love is having on people before they really break out, and that's something that I always want to continue to do. Like I never want to be big enough that I'm only having on people when they do well. And one of the ways I want to be and market myself is like the podcast that has on people before they do anything remarkable, because one, it's more relatable to the audience, and two, if my mission is to bring greater storytelling to the sport of running, if I'm only having on athletes when they do really well, I'm only bringing storytelling to the good parts of running. But sometimes the best parts of running are like like one of my regrets. I wish I had Jess Ton on before she placed fourth at the marathon trials. No one cared about her before that. She placed fourth, and everyone, including myself, I'm at fault here, has her on their podcast. And so something I always try to do, it's kind of like gambling. It's like, who are the athletes I think are going to pop off and do really, really well before they do? And I think I've been like somewhat successful. I feel like even Ethan and Parker are two guys. I had them on long before they really did anything like crazy. They were good runners when they first came on, but like nothing crazy, crazy. And I feel like I've had that happen with a handful of other athletes at every single level in the sport. So I know that's a little off the beaten path, but yeah, a trend I want to continue to buy into is the people who are on the upward trend, and like telling their stories before they do insanely well. And also, I think it's only fair to the athlete to. I know there's so many athletes in the sport, and I can't do it for every single one, but one, to be there for them before they break out. It shows you care for them more as a person and not just for their result. But two, if they are at a low point and they just continue to go lower, also to be there for them. And like, yeah, running is such a small, minuscule sport. It's like, okay, if you win Olympic gold, great. If you don't, whatever, you're still the same person. Like, and I'm sure you still have a great story to tell. There are lessons and learnings from every single episode. Like I'm gonna have Gabby Thomas on the podcast hopefully here shortly, and yeah, she won 3 Olympic golds, so that's going to be a forefront of the conversation. But if she didn't, we would have a fantastic conversation either way. The learnings and lessons are just a little bit different, but the type of person who will be impacted by her winning 3 golds is probably different than the type of person who would be impacted by her, not making the final in the 200. So all that ramble aside, yeah, I'm excited to continue to hopefully chase those like interesting stories of like people before they really hit it off, and then also have those conversations after they make it and recap that with them as well.
Yeah, I'm realizing as you said this, as a coach who's also looking to identify talent, it sounds like we're trying to develop a very similar skill set, which is can we try to kind of look for the people who are, better than what their results have shown so far. So I might need to start tapping into your expertise here for coaching and recruiting purposes. Um, I think one more question that I wanted to ask, and this is a little bit more about your approach and kind of the tactics you use to keep improving your craft. One of the things that I've learned the longer that I've been alive is that as you move from being good to great, unlearning and kind of changing and updating your practices becomes just as important as learning more things. And so my question for you is kind of as the podcast grows and you accumulate closer now to 500 episodes and beyond, what are some of the past practices and beliefs that you've kind of had to unlearn or new skills that you're focused on developing as you move forward?
Oof. Yeah, I think what took you from 0 to 10 using these numbers figuratively won't take you from 10 to 100. And so I think I'm updating my software probably like every 3 or so months. And even like a current problem we have that I need to find a solution to. I'm getting all these Instagram followers, but I'm not converting them well to the podcast. So it's like a very tangible problem that I have not figured out that I'm working through. So what does that look like? It looks like, studying the best podcasts that have good social followings, but also it converts over to podcasts, and like, what are they doing well that I can be doing. And I think, yeah, just with that whole mindset of like turning the podcast into more of a structured business, that's a different game than high schooler who has a hobby of a podcast and doesn't care about making money. Not that money is all that I care about now, but it's now like a legitimate part of what I do. It's business. And so I think I'm unlearning new things all the time, even in terms of just like marketing strategy, right? With AI and all these sort of new things, like it's scary that it's almost a competition, like who can come up with a better title, ChatGPT or I, and I'll like sometimes go with mine, sometimes go with ChatGPT's. But like 2 years ago, you and I wouldn't have even really known what ChatGPT is. And so I would say like unlearning personal bias that you think you're better than you are at like creating a podcast title, all those sorts of things, or even like the algorithm on a Instagram changes like every 2 to 3 weeks, which is the most annoying thing ever. Meta, just keep it the same. That you have to figure out like what works well, what doesn't. And even like for Spotify, the layout sometimes can change. And so you have to think really strategically about, you know, how you want to change things to catch people's attention more. But I think at the end of the day, like the biggest thing for me is everything is downstream from creating the best possible product, which is the best possible conversation. And so even we could make the best banger clip of all time from this, but like that's only going to happen if we have the best possible conversation. And in reality, like I only want to create things that are like that I'm really proud of, that are the best possible product I know given the circumstances. And so maybe this isn't directly answering your question, but I think the focus for me is more um, refining what that best product and conversation looks like on a daily basis. What that definition is, I think, has changed as I've grown and gotten better. And then achieving and striving after that goal of best conversation, best product, and everything is downstream from that. Better social content, better guests, better, more listens, because it'll get shared more if it's better, kind of the whole 9 yards. And so occasionally I'll get like really in the nitty gritty of everything. And then I think I get grounded and I realize, like, dude, just have the best freaking conversation you can have because everything's downstream from that. So I don't know if that gave you any practical insight, but that's just kind of my thought. I know I didn't really answer that super directly.
No, no. I think it definitely does. And your last point kind of reminded me of something that Morgan Housel has said on a few different podcasts. He used to be a writer. I forget who he wrote for, but before he went independent. And he said that the company brought in a social media consultant, and they were going through all the tactics that you would try to use to try to get the most likes and retweets and whatnot. And it was, use these hashtags, post at this time of day. And it just dawned on him like, you could play that game, or you can just play the game of writing the best damn content that's out on the internet, and then people will follow you anyway. So I think it's just a clarifying thought, which is like keep the main thing, which for you is have the best conversations out there, and then you will organically be able to grow your following regardless. So I love that. Now moving towards kind of the end of section one of our podcast, one question that I wanted to wrap up this part with was what would success in 2025 look like for the running effective for you personally?
Yeah, if you go through my end of review document, that's also kind of a 2025 planning document all mixed in one. You would see all sorts of different goals, from revenue goals to dream guest goals to amount of podcast play goals. But I think what it boils down to that I can control is what is my output on a day-to-day level. And something I've started to say in the last few months that I want to really continue to bring with me into 2025 is if I can lay my head on my pillow every single night knowing that I gave that day really good output, I'll feel good about myself. And I think this past summer I really struggled and was kind of like in a rut. And a big reason why is because I just didn't have that same fire. And with that, I think my output wasn't what it should have been. And so I like kind of walked around with this guilt of like, you're not producing the results on paper were good, but the output wasn't. And so even though the results were good, this just shows how like process driven I am. Even though the results were good, because I knew the output wasn't what it should have been or what it could have been, I wasn't really fulfilled or happy with my work. And so in 2025, I think the thing that I can control that will unlock all the goals that I want to accomplish is output. And yeah, if any day that you call me next year, if you say, what was your output today? If I could be like, I did X, Y, and Z, and I feel really good about the work that I put in, I think I'll be thrilled with 2025. I think that's a way more healthy perspective than listing the 20 goals I have written down that, yes, I have influence over, but there are external factors and maybe some luck that would need to play and roll in my favor, rather than just like, I'm going to approach every single day with extreme output, extreme vision, extreme dedication. And if I feel good laying my head on the pillow every night, knowing that I gave that day a really good effort, boom, like success will happen inevitably. I just know it.
Yeah, I mean, what more could you ask for, right? Like being held accountable to your outputs, the things that are in your control, like that's ultimately what's going to move the needle the most. And it for the most part will factor out luck and chance occurrences. Like you're going to approach your craft with a level of mastery that means, like you're going to know you're putting out the best content you possibly can. And then you're like, let the chips fall where they may, right? Like, I'm going to bet on myself here, and I'm going to try to make the most of the upcoming year. So I love that approach. And I think it's been fun for me to kind of get a chance to catch you one on one and force you to go on the record and kind of give some of your thoughts about the trends we're seeing in track and field, and also kind of talk about the business strategy. So certainly a pleasure for me. I will hand it over to you as we, I think, transition to the next segment of our podcast, which is taking our annual reviews and reflecting on some of the insights that we've had as they relate to our personal lives, the sport, and everything in between.
Absolutely. I don't need to say more other than, yeah, that we're just going to go through three of our biggest personal learnings and insights from the year. I'll just start us off here so that we can get rolling. A few of my insights, two of them kind of come from a trip that I took to Cabo that you know extensively about, but the audience doesn't. And I won't give too much background about it other than was around a ton of super successful people, and the kind of group business retreat was called the Inflection. It was for people who were kind of at an inflection point in their lives or businesses. And when I would talk about the running effect, one of the things that I like kept saying was like sustainable success, all sorts of verbiage around sustainable. And one of the guys, and these guys are all way, way, way more successful than me, was like, Dom, you got to like toss that out of your vocabulary. He's like, how old are you? I was like 19. He's like, yeah, that shouldn't even be in your vocabulary. I was like, elaborate. He's like, every single one of us here was like very, very unsustainable for a period of time. And while it is a very good thing, a very good thing to be sustainable, like you're in a chapter of life that you probably should be unsustainable in. And so my point here, and one of the biggest learnings for me, is one, it's okay to be unsustainable for periods of time, and two, to view life in chapters, and specifically the unsustainability within that chapter of life. I think there were so many moments for me early on in this year before I got this insight that I was super stressed because I was aware how unsustainable that day or week was. But as I learned to embrace the unsustainability and realize that, like, yeah, sustainability shouldn't even be in my vocabulary as a 19-year-old who's trying to grow one of the biggest sports media companies in the world, it's okay if I'm stressed, or it's okay if like I have a week or a month where like, yeah, things are like really tight and I like don't feel it shouldn't be sustainable, I guess is kind of the point here. And I think a lot of where my mindset around sustainability comes is the people I look up to, mentors like yourself, yeah, they probably have a little more holistic lives because of being in farther down the road, like in a more structured setup, and with that they can have sustainability. But like reality is, like a 30-year-old who's married and has a kid, their life should look fundamentally different than a 19-year-old who's like very independent, trying to grow a company, doesn't have much responsibility. And I think the path I was falling into was comparing myself versus these married people with kids. And the kind of the realization for me, even of writing this, is like, um, too often I've fallen into the trap of thinking my life right now should match up with the quote unquote dream life, when in reality, the only way to pave the way for the dream life is to be unsustainable right now. And yes, it's great to have sustainability in your life, and I think you should. But reality is, like, specifically if you're in high school, we have a lot of high school listeners. And Alex, you can speak to this from your high school years. You had the craziest high school schedule, but I think you should have. And when I'm a parent one day and like have high schoolers, like, what else is like a 14 to 18-year-old going to do? Like, it is so much better to like take AP classes, go straight into practice, and then go to like, I don't know, like choir or dance practice, rather than like sit at home playing video games because you feel like you need a rest to be sustainable. Like, I think, I don't want to put ages on it, but I think there's a period of life where, yeah, you should be doing many, many things at once. And also, it's just like the Hormozy idea of like, what's the story you want to tell? And I think the unsustainability route, at least for this chapter of life, makes a lot of sense for me right now, rather than like, yeah, chasing after this sustainable life that trying to basically live the married life with kids when I'm not married and don't have kids. I shouldn't have that. And I think the success of my company kind of relies on me being unsustainable at the moment. And even just like stating these things aloud to myself and like writing and reflecting on this process, so much more freeing. I mentioned like being stressed about being unsustainable, and learning to accept it, I think, has been massive. And I'll just close out this learning and lesson with a quote kind of that is in relation to this. The hard things lead to the good things. The seasons that test your strength, the situations that feel uncomfortable, and the decisions that require courage are the very things that will lead you toward true fulfillment. If you're willing to walk through the fire and surrender to uncertainty, you will eventually experience all the beauty that awaits you on the other side. So stop running away from the hard things, because the hard things build the foundation for the good things to grow.
Yes. I think that's a phenomenal point. It reminds me of the idea that if you're going to sequence your life and break it up into different phases, you first need to work harder and then you can work smarter. Only then do you earn the right to work smarter. And a lot of that means saying yes to a lot of things in the beginning and then saying no later. I know we talked about that on our last podcast. I think one thing I did want to preface before we dive into, more reflections is I don't think we're trying to give prescriptive life advice here. Like, this is just kind of the conclusions we've reached about our own lives, and we may have opinions about what the right thing to do is, but they're purely opinions and just that.
Totally.
One thing I did want to, one quote I wanted to share to round out that idea. I know we have shared it before with each other. It's also from Alex Hormozy, and he said, "There's no perfect way to live your 20s. You either live them up and become underskilled as a 30-year-old, or you work them up and become an underlived 30-year-old. You just have to figure out which one you'd rather be, accept the trade-offs, and know that there are no do-overs. There are more people I know and that I've met in my life who are dissatisfied by their live it up 20s rather than work it up. Most of the time in your 20s, you have no idea what you want, but if you work hard, then along the way, you can gain perspective on what's important to you." So again, the path that you choose in life is completely up to you. That's a totally individualized decision and calculation. But just like assessing the trends and the decisions we've made in our own lives, like that's, my most educated guess at what the right path is the one that we've chosen to go down, which oftentimes relies on hard work. We could be wrong in 10 years. We could regret it, but it's definitely what I've been leaning towards right now, and totally agree with the point that you made.
Love it. Okay, give me insight one for you.
All right. Insight one for me, and I'm borrowing this one from a Stoic philosopher named Seneca. He said, "We suffer more in imagination than we do in reality." And when I first heard it, I wasn't really quite sure what to make of it. I had to process it and chew on it for a little bit, but I think I've come to realize how much the fear of what might happen in the future can paralyze us, often more than the actual situation ever could, right? And this tendency isn't entirely our fault. It's part of our evolutionary past. Our ancestors, the ones who survived, were hyper vigilant to possible threats, and the ones who were worry free and carefree, they didn't make it out of the African savannah, right? But like, here's the thing: we don't live in that environment anymore, right? Today, we live in relatively safe environments, and those Paleolithic instincts to worry and to catastrophize, while they were like once pretty essential for our survival, they're now working more against us than they are for us. And I think instead of keeping us alive, they're holding us back and amplifying fears that rarely materialize. I read a book a few weeks ago written by a guy named Oliver Berkman. The book is called Meditations for Mortals. Great read. And there was one quote that stood out to me, and he said, "What is worry at its core but the activity of a mind trying to picture every possible bridge that might need to be crossed in the future and figuring out how to cross them? The irony is that we can't possibly anticipate every challenge, nor can we know how we will handle them until they arise. Yet, we waste so much energy trying to preemptively solve problems that might never exist." And as soon as I read this, it brought me back to a conversation I had with an athlete who I'm coaching. This is before I even started working with Bowerman. He's an ultra runner who lives in Colorado. And earlier this year, he was preparing for his first 100-mile race. That's obviously a massive undertaking. He has to cross mountainous terrain, go through the night, run for more than 24 hours. And in the lead up to the race, we were having conversations about, discussing his race plan, right? And discussing all the strategies and tactics we were going to use over that period of time. And we were talking about the nutrition strategies that he'd use to stay fueled along the course, how his crew would support him at the aid stations. And we were talking about kind of adjustments we would make for weather and conditions and all those other variables. And I think throughout these conversations, of which there were multiple, I think despite all of our planning, there was one truth that became very apparent, which is that there's always more things that could happen than you could possibly anticipate. And I think during our conversations, I shared this idea that like it's very hard to predict vulnerabilities in your race plan up front, because ultimately, what is risk but what's left over when you think you've thought of everything? That's the definition I stole from Morgan Housel, which I really love, right? Like no matter how many scenarios you prepare for, there's always going to be surprises on race day. And the real test of your race plan is not designing it to avoid every setback, but instead responding to the unexpected with adaptability and resilience. So as it turns out, true to form, we did have an unexpected scenario on race day. I think it was about halfway through the race, maybe a little bit less. He ran out of water. Actually, no, before that, he actually, there was a poorly marked section of the course causing him to make a wrong turn. And he had kind of underestimated how much water he was going to need during the hot part of the day. So he basically ran out of water, and it led to this momentary feeling of panic that kind of cast a shadow over the rest of the race. And this guy's tough as nails. He's an ex-Marine, just awesome dude. He pushed through and like completed the race. And I think that was really a testament to his mental toughness and his determination. But when we debriefed afterwards, we realized that like no amount of contingency planning could have prevented that moment. We had prepared for so many different scenarios, but like the real challenge came from something we couldn't even anticipate. And I think it reinforced, I think, a fundamental truth, not only about race planning, but about life and something that I've been reflecting on more generally, which was that in this scenario, we could not choreograph every step of the 100-mile race. We couldn't tame Mother Nature to the exact specifications of what we wanted, right? We could plan endlessly to predict every outcome, but ultimately, the real challenge that presented itself came from a direction we never expected. And when those challenges came up, they were actually not as bad as we saw them in our own imagination, right? Like our brain loves to catastrophize. We often exaggerate the potential consequences of an action to spare ourselves the burden of making a difficult choice or any choice at all. And I think it's important for everyone listening here to remember and think about your own life. If you're sufficiently old enough, which most people here are probably at least 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, and you've endured some challenges in life, it's important to remember that you have a perfect track record for making it through your toughest days. If you were incapable of dealing with life's challenges, you wouldn't be here right now. Now, that doesn't mean that tougher challenges aren't going to present themselves again in the future, but you can't control what will happen then. You can only trust your ability to deal with whatever life throws at you. And to wrap this thought up and to tie it back to the Stoic philosopher theme that I started with, Marcus Aurelius, who's a Roman emperor thousands of years ago, and he wrote he had a personal journal that he kept, which has since been published into a book. He didn't know it at the time that it was going to be published, but it was. And he had this great line which he said, "Never let the future disturb you. You will meet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present." So I think this year I've learned that I want to spend less time imagining the worst case scenarios, and instead I want to invest more energy in betting in my ability to handle challenges and figure them out as they come.
Not sure I could really add anything more to that other than a funny caveat, which is people have always said like, "Oh, what's your like random baby name that you'd name, a future kid?" I actually think Seneca would be such a baller name for a son. Seneca Schleter, come on.
That's pretty good.
anyways, we'll see if that ever happens. I don't think I could get my future wife on board with that, but we'll see. Okay, my second point here is your capacity for hard work is much higher than you think. And this lesson and learning, I think, has been grown throughout the years. I think one of the things my parents did excellently was instilled in my siblings and I like a high work ethic. But I think throughout the years, being surrounded by more and more successful people, this lesson has kind of become exacerbated, and my eyes have just been open to what it means to truly work, what hard work means, quite frankly. And I think I see this in business and life, even in the stories of honestly Bowerman athletes of just like, how did you do that workout? What? Excuse me, I could only do 25% of that at my own paces. And I think that's like really inspiring and pushes me in my own ways. And this point also comes a little bit from that time in Cabo, where I was surrounded by those seven guys so much more successful than me. One of my favorite stories that I did share with you, Alex, is Sahil Bloom, who's been on the podcast before and a very, very good friend. He shared the story where back in his venture capital days, he would set alarms throughout the night to check his email every 2 to 3 hours, just so that he was staying on top of like clients and internal stuff and the whole 9 yards. And to me, I was just like, wow, I feel so soft. And like, I'm not saying every single person, again, it kind of goes back to point one. That's not sustainable. Sahil is so glad he doesn't do that present day, but he realized that was a chapter in his life that he needed to do that. And even that simple story just reminds me of like what some people did, how some people define hard work. And someone like Sahil, if he saw my day, would be like, well, that's more than a rest day. Even like using Sahil as an example again, he wakes up at like 4:30 a.m. like religiously. Or even using someone like you as an example. Like we had a conversation a few weeks ago and you were taking me through like how you structure your phone for like to optimize your life. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I just, wow, there's so much untapped potential in terms of just like working hard and thinking more thoroughly through my life. And even in Cabo, using Sahil again, like he would wake up like 1 to 2 hours before everyone else and work like hours before anyone was awake. And people like that, I think using them as signals and indications of, wow, you can change your definition of words and terms over time. And I think hard work is one that a lot of people, unless you're Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk listening to this, you can probably work harder. And those guys would probably say they can work harder too, which is a little scary. And yeah, I think that's just like important if you want to raise your ceiling. Like you can do way more, way better, more consistently. And I think the biggest piece here, like tangible piece here for the listener that like I really want to work on in 2025, because I work hard, but like again, that output piece, going back to the first part of this conversation, I know there's a lot of untapped potential there for me. I think that the practical takeaway is like, and I did this in my end of year review. I wrote down my ideal day and I was like, oh, okay. Like, I think I can do that for a day, and live your ideal day once and then repeat it for as long as you possibly can. And that's something I really want to do in 2025 is like, I wrote down what that ideal day looks like. I think it's manageable, and that's a big piece. Like, don't be like structured to the minute. Like give yourself some grace within a day. No day goes perfectly. Things pop up, but like try to live that ideal day and then repeat it for as long as you possibly can. And tying this back to the first part, like truly your capacity for hard work is so much higher than you think, whether that's in school, like taking another AP class, or applying to another college, or in running, like doing a few more miles per week if it makes sense for you, or like pushing a little harder on a workout if it makes sense for you, or yeah, apply that to any avenue of life. And tying this up with a quote that kind of relates, but I really like it. And I don't think I've ever shared this one with you, Alex. I think you'll enjoy it. The quote is, be irrational. Nothing great was done with sanity. Be bold, be extreme. Give the world something it's never seen before. Ignore rules, ignore data, ignore the target market for a target that's never been shot. Oh, such a good line. Insane goals are performance enhancing drugs. They fuel everyone. They wake you up. They keep you up. They push boundaries you never knew you had. So to change the world tomorrow, ignore the world today. Vision matters more than reason.
Man, yeah. Um, that point resonates with me very deeply, for sure. And there were two thoughts I had that I just wanted to add on and reflect on a little bit further. I think Alexis Ohanian, the co-founder of Reddit, had a quote where he said something along the lines of like, we often don't realize that something is broken until someone else shows us a better way. And in the
Mm.
same vein, the idea that like a lot of times we don't realize that we can work harder until we're around people who are working harder and can show us what that new definition looks like. So I think some of the tactical takeaways here is like be very mindful of the network of people that you surround yourself with. Most people in your life are not there by choice; they're there by default. And if you put yourself in networks where people work really hard and they have high aspirations, like that's going to rub off on you, and you're gonna start to become more like those people as well. And it's certainly going to expand your mind and your capacity for hard work. The second thing is I think a lot of these changes are made incrementally, right? Like the idea in exercise, there's an idea in exercise physiology called progressive overload, which is that the way you get stronger is not to go like 100x higher than like what your one rep maximum is. It's like go 5% higher, go 10% higher, and like your ability, your capacity for hard work is going to increase the more hard work that you do, right? So I think it's one of these things where if you move the needle incrementally, like, and you look back, all of a sudden you're like, wow, I can do a lot more. But it wasn't because I tried to completely reinvent myself one day. It was just breaking it down one step, one day at a time, and then ultimately that compounds into something greater than you could have imagined at the beginning.
Love it. Love it. Okay. Point two for you.
Okay, insight number two. This was one of the more liberating insights that I think I had, and it's something that I've definitely been working through over the past couple of years, but I hadn't really put it into writing until I knew I was doing this podcast and I was going through the annual review. The idea is that my neurotic habits around performance weren't helping me nearly as much as I used to think that they did. And so to kind of illustrate this point, I'm going to tell a quick story. Actually, you may not even know this, but 3 weeks ago, I ran the USATF Club Cross Country Championships in Tacoma, Washington. Very last minute decision. I didn't like publicize it or anything. And it was actually the first time that I towed the line in a cross country race since 2021, and that it was the same race 3 years prior. It was the Club Cross Country Championships in Tallahassee, Florida. And what I really want to do is kind of compare and contrast the experience that I had in those two races, and how much I think growth and evolution that I went through over the course of that period of time. if I rewind the clock to 2021, this was a period of my life where I was deeply entrenched in the collegiate environment of running and performance. I had access to every imaginable resource that you could think of through UNC and Stanford beforehand. I had athletic trainers, I had, obviously great coaching, massage therapists, the whole nine yards. And I had seemingly unlimited time to pursue like any marginal gain that I thought would be beneficial for performance. And so I did it, right? Like I had an elaborate activation routine that would take me between 30 and 45 minutes before I'd even show up at practice. Before races, I would spend hours brainstorming like the perfect mantra to think about when the race got hard. And then the morning of the race, I would write that on my hand. I mean, my warm up was like totally optimized at the time. I thought like I had to do 10 minutes at 6:30 pace, and then I had to do an up tempo segment for 5 minutes, and then I have to do all these trills and strides. You get the point. I was really pursuing all these marginal gains, and these things kind of became fairly consuming. If we now look at 2024, my environment is constrained by several factors. I'm now working a full-time job, which I'm trying to balance with training. I have far less time and far fewer resources to dedicate to both my body and the training itself. Most of my runs are really early in the morning before any responsibilities start. This goal race was not something that I had plastered on my wall and projected 12 months into the future. In fact, I almost missed the entry deadline for club cross country because I was so late to apply. I think I like 3 or 4 weeks beforehand, I was like, oh, I'm moderately fit. Why don't I do a couple of key workouts and see if I want to do it? So ultimately I made that decision. And I think despite these like very, very different approaches, the outcomes were surprisingly, from my perspective, surprisingly similar. I think the real difference it wasn't really in the mileage that I did or the circumstances leading up to it or my training volume or anything. I think the biggest thing that I want to hit on here was my mentality. I think in 2021, I clung to all these rituals and habits, believing that they were absolutely essential for peak performance. And I treated them all like the gospel truth, right? And in 2024, I didn't have the luxury to follow those rituals perfectly. The time and energy that I had was totally constrained by my environment, right? And instead, what I did was I made the decision to lean into, of course, fully buy into the training itself. Like that is something that is always going to yield like the biggest results, but also lean into adaptability, right? And I think it taught me a lot about what actually matters on race day. And I think what's fascinating is that even though my preparation in 2024 was far less like quote perfect by my old standards, the results were almost identical. So in 2021, I finished eighth, and in 2024, I finished 11th. And arguably, so I was 3 places lower in arguably a much stronger field. I'm not here to debate that right now, but there were a lot of pros ahead of me in 2024, and it really forced me to ask the question, like, how much did those rigid rituals and neurotic habits beyond the training itself, how much did that actually contribute to my performance? And the conclusion that I ultimately arrived at was that performance isn't about perfection and control. Success, in my opinion, doesn't hinge on trying to catch lightning in a bottle or trying to follow some flawless script that has to unfold in this like exact sequential order. I think the foundation that you build in training through the day-to-day grind, through your consistency and your preparation is what carries you through. And that represents like this freight train of momentum that has so much inertia, it's almost unstoppable. And it's not the compulsive rituals that you pile on top of that in the week leading into the race or the day of the race that are really going to move the needle that much. And it's funny because now as a coach, now I'm standing on the other side of the stopwatch most of the time, besides the fact when I occasionally get inspired to race. Um, I will oftentimes really latch onto examples of where athletes will say, hey, I felt terrible on that warm up, but like I managed to still have a really good workout anyway. And the reason I harp on those examples so much is because it really does a good job of severing the connection between two ideas, which is that we think are compatible, but they're not really, which is I think I need to feel perfect in order to run my best, right? Like we're inclined to believe that we need race day to feel magical to the point where we can channel some kind of superhuman effort. But if there's any lesson to take away from my experience and my reflections is that you don't need to catch lightning in a bottle to perform well. I'm not saying that anyone needs to like chastise themselves or punish themselves for having some of these routines and these superstitions. They're not inherently bad. They all served a purpose at some point in time. But a lot of times they're really relics of the past that you've brought along unnecessarily. Like they served a purpose at some point in time. They helped you feel in control when you were younger and more inexperienced and less successful. But over time, they become a lot more like superstitions, and what I tend to think of it now as like this accumulation of debris that I just brought along with me. So I think just to start wrapping this up, like we often overestimate the importance of perfect conditions and underestimate the power of adaptability. That was one thing that I talked about in my first insight, right? Like if you're overly reliant on this rigid optimization strategy, you need perfect sleep before your race, you need the perfect warm up, you need the perfect morning routine. I think you're setting yourself up for failure because optimization without considering reality ultimately is going to become superstition. And reality is inherently unpredictable. It requires adaptability. People who carry the most superstitions with them, I think, are the easiest people to break. They're the most fragile because one puff of wind is the thing that causes their whole house of cards to collapse. So last thought, like I think the biggest regret I hear from people, and even when I reflect on myself, isn't about the failures or the mistakes I've made. Like I've gotten over those a long time ago. A lot of it is more about how much time did I spend worrying? How much joy was stolen by fear that wasn't even necessary in the first place? It wasn't really contributing meaningfully to my outcomes. I think the results you're going to get in life are probably going to come anyway, either because of the natural talent you already have, or more likely the foundational work you've already done. And so my takeaway piece of advice would be give yourself permission to loosen your grip on the steering wheel a little bit and just enjoy the ride.
Amazing. Oh, such a good point. And congrats on racing. I did have absolutely no clue. The
Thank
one,
you.
and man, this is just showing I'm so washed as a runner and need to race some races when my analogies are coming from work and not running anymore. Terrible. Anyways, I think my only point off of what you said there is when you do certain things and succeed under certain circumstances, it gives you proof that you can then do it again. And so my work example is there were many times that I would like have to go to bed at 12 or 1 on an event marketing trip, and I would have to wake up at 4 a.m. for a morning flight. Anyone who knows me well knows I like have the coveted 8-hour sleep rule that I just feel tired and annoyed at life if I get like roughly under 7. And so anytime these things would pop up very early on, I would get so stressed, like, oh, I just get so paranoid, like, oh, are you going to be able to wake up on time? Are you going to wake up to your alarm? Are you going to miss your flight? Like all those sort of feelings. Will you be able to function the rest of the day? And after doing it once or twice, then when the opportunity presented itself again, I was like, oh, you did it these 2 times. You're totally fine. You can do it again. Extrapolating that to running, it's the same exact thing, I think. Now, don't like not sleep for a race so that you can say you did it, but I think yeah, if you miss your warm-up routine for a workout and that workout goes well, take that into next time you have a workout where you can't do your warm-up routine or whatever it might be. I think, yeah, confidence comes, it's built, and I think when you do certain things enough times, then you can draw from that experience and say, oh, I did this without this. I'm totally okay. Okay, my final point for you, Alex. One of the biggest changes, if not the biggest on paper, changes for the year from me was moving from Austin, Texas, back to Ohio. This time, Columbus. I grew up in Toledo. Now I live in Columbus. I moved at the end of January, and that kind of point was shaped by environment. And I absolutely loved. So my point here is that environment shapes everything. Where you live and who you're surrounded by has an effect on every single aspect of your life. And in my opinion is the thing you should ground your life on. So for me, I loved living in Austin, and I really, really think I needed that 8 months there to take the running effect to where it needed to go, as well as to mature as a person and like get away from family, having grown up under my parents' home for 18 years, which was lovely. But I think you hit a point where you need to be independent and grow in those ways. And how I describe it, like have your washing machine break and you can't call either parent because they're not close enough to you to help you come fix it. And you have to figure those things out. I think matures you a ton. And also this point I think is more relevant to probably a like out of college 22 and beyond. If you're in high school, listen to see if it intrigues you, or put a bookmark to come back 4 years from now, because it's not really applicable. But yeah, so I think for me, Austin, loved it, was necessary for me to take the running effect to where it needed to go. So grateful for that time in Austin as a city. Absolutely remarkable. But I would say being close to family is so important to me, and moving back and being surrounded by them and such a strong community has been so transformative for nearly every aspect of my life, and I think has really put into the limelight how important your environment is. And there's like the stat everyone knows, which is sit within 25 feet of a high performer, performance improves by 15%. Sit within 25 feet of a low performer, performance declines by 30%. Or like you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, but it's actually worse than that. It's you resort to the worst of the five. And I love those quotes. I say them all the time, but I think my point here is less about performance and more about like, where do you feel home? Where do you feel nurtured? Where do you feel most loved and appreciated? For me, as someone who is a highly motivated, driven person, like I live by myself at the moment. I don't need someone waking me up on time to go get my miles, or work, or like go to the sauna. Like that's so innate to me. And I think a lot of our listeners are like that. Like we don't need people to hold our hand to do hard things. And so I think it's more important to think about those qualities when you structure your life, of like, yeah, where do you feel nurtured? Where do you feel most loved? Rather than like, oh, where's the place that's gonna like make me more motivated and driven. And for me, as a person who I feel like already has those qualities and skills, this year I think really put into the limelight, like structuring and putting yourself in an environment that is like way more holistic and grounds you a ton. And I think moving back to Columbus for me was massive for that. And not to judge other people's life, but I think a lot of people get lost in that, where like New York City is a great example. Just like the hustle, constant hustle culture. And I think a lot of, actually, quite frankly, and I'm sure I could find some studies to back this up, like a lot of where like depression and hopelessness comes from is a lack of grounding. And I think you get that grounding from like strong environment. And I was blessed enough. I know not everyone was privileged in this way, but I was blessed to be raised by a great family and be close with my siblings. And, if you have that setup, like cling on to those relationships, hold tight to them, because I think they're precious. And closing out this thought, loved this question, one of the best questions that I came across this year, which is, if a flower doesn't bloom, do you blame the flower or its environment? And I think for whatever reason in society, we blame the person rather than the environment, when in reality, if you manipulated the environment, I can almost guarantee a different result. Like if you took the most mediocre high school boy and you gave him to me, and I got to control the 5 people who he spent time with, give me like David Goggins, Alex Ostberg, Hormozy, like this guy's going to be jacked. He's going to be a millionaire. He's going to be able to run 100 miles way faster than anyone else. And I can just like assume that with most people. And I think, yeah, it's unfortunate that in society today, I think we a lot of times blame the person rather than the environment that they're in. And so I guess wrapping up this point, just like environment shapes absolutely everything. And if you want better results or you want to be a different type of person, surround yourself with the type of people that encourage those behaviors. And more specifically, and again, I think this is a more apropos point to older people, but like, don't forget your roots if you have good roots, and make sure that you are surrounding yourself with people who you feel loved and nurtured by, and not just like motivated by. I think there's a difference. I think both are important, but I think this year was the first time that I realized that, like, oh, the first piece is important, like being around people that truly feel like home. So, and that to me was Columbus rather than Austin.
Yeah. I love that point, and it's something I think about all the time as well. I don't know if it's just a very American virtue to think a lot about like this heroic individualism where like you're going to take on the world, but I think what we often do is we over-index on like an individual talent rather than thinking about, again, the micro environment or the macro environment that they're putting themselves in. And I think what the way I think about this is like, how are you positioning yourself both within society and where you're living, where you're operating? And I think it's hard to appreciate, but over the long run, the average person who constantly puts himself in a good position is always going to beat the genius who finds himself in a bad position, right? Like what looks like talent is often just good positioning. I This didn't make the cut, but my fourth insight that I was going to share, and you hit on it just as well, was that market dynamics triumph over individual performance all the time. And this is zooming out a little bit further for you. I know you talked a lot about the micro environment, like where you're living, the people you're surrounding yourself with, but I'm also thinking about this, like where you're positioning yourself within a company or within an industry. And I know I referenced them heavily in the last podcast we did, but in a book that Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett wrote, they said, good jockeys will do well on good horses, but not on broken down nags, right?
Mm.
And similarly, like if you're in like a technology company right now, like it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to realize that growth solves all problems. If you're a mediocre employee at NVIDIA this past year, like
Oh
you're going to
gosh.
do a lot better than, a phenomenal employee at General Motors, right? The same person can thrive or struggle depending on the industry that you're in, right? Another way to put this, another good metaphor, is a modest surfer can look amazing on big waves, but in flat water, even the best surfers are going to struggle. So ultimately, I think success isn't just about how hard you're going to paddle; it's about the waves you choose to ride. And Definitely relates to your point. I think is something that everybody should, questions they should ask yourself. What industry do I want to work in? What are the expected returns here? Who are the people I'm going to surround myself with? Those are all really important as well.
Close us out. Lesson
Should we
3.
close it out? All right. Sounds good. My last insight from this year, and this definitely crystallized specifically in 2024, is that rather when I've been faced with difficult choices, rather than focusing on making the right decision, I have spent a lot more time and energy trying to make the decision right. I know that's a bit of a tongue twister. And so I'll, expand on that a
I'll
little
be
bit
honest,
more.
when you sent the text of your points, I was like, I'm curious to hear more about this one because I have no clue what that
Well,
means.
I will tell you right now. Hopefully, it will be clear by the time I'm done talking. Um, Life doesn't give you the luxury of split testing reality, right? You can't run parallel simulations of your life to see how different choices will play out. And for comparable options that are both promising, I think upfront, the differences between them are either negligible or completely unknowable. And what matters the most is what you actually do after you make a choice. That defines the decision a lot more than the information you had at the beginning where you were actually making the choice. And I think what really brought, hammered this home for me was a conversation that I was having with Coach Milt, well known to this podcast, has been a life mentor of mine for the past decade. And I was talking to him about a lot of the significant life transitions that I've gone through. A lot of them have popped up unannounced, and I've had a certain amount of time pressure to make a decision that oftentimes is going to lead to fairly significant change. Example of this would be like grad transferring from Stanford to UNC during COVID, deciding whether or not I was going to take a seventh year of eligibility or move into the workforce, or leaving a life that I was very happy with in Chapel Hill and pursuing the exciting opportunity to be a Bowerman assistant coach. And each one of these decisions, when I thought back on them, they brought so much distress. Like I agonized over them so much and I lost so much sleep. And looking back on them, it just all that stress just felt like completely overkill because every time I made the decision, or at least within a few months, it just seemed to work out. And I ended up loving almost every change that I made, no matter how difficult the choice seemed, or yet no matter how difficult it seemed initially. And I was a little bit confused looking at my past because I was like, why do these things keep working out? Like, I know enough about randomness and chance in the universe to understand that, like, if you make 10 choices, like, the majority of them might go well if you're a good person and you work hard, but like some of them aren't going to go in your favor. And I didn't feel old enough, I didn't feel perceptive enough, or lucky enough to make, basically 10 out of 10 life choices correctly. And I kept asking myself, like, how do I keep getting this right? And in hindsight, I think what I realized is maybe I wasn't really batting 1,000. I was just really learning a deeper truth about decision making. And what I've come to understand is that a few things. A, there's rarely one correct answer. B, you have to lower your bar from perfect to good enough when you're making a choice. And C, commitment is really the thing that transforms choices into the right ones. So just diving into those briefly, there's this idea we have that there's an illusion of a binary set of outcomes and a perfect choice out there. When I was reflecting on these decisions, I've been operating under this false assumption that there had to be one single right choice. And at that fork in the road, turning left was going to mean I was going to be happy and euphoric forever, and turning right was going to mean I made the wrong choice and I was going to be miserable. And there's really a lot more ambiguity there. It's not nearly that binary. And we tend to agonize over these decisions as if there is that one correct answer, but that's not really the case. If a decision feels hard, it's probably because there's not a clear correct answer. If there was, you would automatically make it and you wouldn't be distressed about the decision. And someone once said, I don't have the quote to attribute it to, but he or she said, the more similar two choices seem, the less the decision should matter, yet the harder it is to choose between them. So what ends up happening is we spend so much time agonizing over decisions that probably matter the least, because like all the stress that you feel during that decision making process didn't actually make the decision better. It just made the process harder. Another point that I really love is lowering the bar from perfect to good enough. There's a psychological researcher named Barry Schwartz who's done a lot of work in this space, and he says once you reach a certain region of excellence, the differences between options become either negligible or impossible to discover in advance. In other words, there's a point where the extra effort required to find the absolute best option isn't really worth it because the options are already so good. The example he would use is you take a senior in high school who's been admitted to two Ivy League schools, let's just say Yale and Brown, for instance. Both are great schools. There's subtle differences between them, but those subtle differences are probably unlikely to make a significant impact in the overall experience. And the small advantage that one or the other has is probably either due to chance or the active choices you make once you've already enrolled rather than any kind of inherent superiority. So I think we should shift our attention away from searching exhaustively for the theoretical best option and instead appreciate the excellence of what already exists and then making the most of that. Um, the last thing, and then I'll move to my conclusion, is that, going back to this illusion of a perfect choice, there are inevitable trade offs you make with every decision. When you're making tough choices, especially ones that involve staying or leaving, you have to realize that there's going to be loss either way. Either you're going to grieve the comfort of what you left behind, or you're going to mourn the opportunity you didn't take. And the feeling of loss is always going to be there, and it's probably going to be short lived. But it's not the decision itself that you make. It's really what you do afterwards. And I think commitment is what turns a decision into the right one, because by fully investing in your choice, you create the conditions for success. So if you're at a fork in the road right now and you're asking yourself, I would say ask yourself, are you chasing the perfect decision, or are you focused on making the decision work after it's made? And if you've been listening to my rambling over the past couple of minutes, you'll know that the latter part of that question is, I think, what matters a lot more. So I don't think life is about finding the perfect path. It's about walking the path that you choose with purpose. And I would focus on making a good enough choice, committing to it, and that will then allow you to make the decision right.
Oof, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the genius of Alex Ostberg. I actually have a fourth point that I will keep to 60 seconds or less. Didn't tell you about this, but I actually think I haven't talked about like running at all. So it's my one running point for today. And if you want to give a quick response after, if you have anything, feel free to wrap us up here. Fourth point here, relation to running, that is very close to my heart this past year, and a massive reflection as someone who really ran religiously from the age of 5, maybe not like early middle school years, but has been running from the age of 5, is the saying, distance makes the heart grow fonder, even for running. And I think if you're struggling with your running, take time away to fall in love again. And I would say the past few weeks, after taking significant time off, and even within that time off has been many 3-mile jogs with music, or with like, not all of this is just like time off, but there's a massive difference between 65 miles in 6 days with 2 workouts in a long run, and running 3 miles at the end of the day because you feel like running just 3 miles at a pace that you don't really care about. And I think, yeah, taking time away and giving yourself the ability to not be hyper specific is totally okay. And if you're not enjoying your running, yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely periods where you're going to have those feelings and you need to push through them, but definitely sit down. And if you're not enjoying your running and you haven't for a long period of time, or you just feel burnt out, take a week off, take a month off. Like, running is not everything. You as a person are a person without running. Running is something you do. It is not who you are. And I think for me, taking this time off has, one, just been really, really good for probably both physically and mentally, as well as like I feel ready and chomping at the bit to chase after some things in 2025. And I do think that distance makes the heart grow fonder, even for running.
Yes, and I'll just close it out by saying I think this actually relates very nicely to my second point, which was again about how my neurotic habits weren't really improving my performance as much as I thought. When I compare and contrast these stories of 2021 and 2024, these two times that I raced, what I kind of left out was what happened in the middle there. And a lot of that was my heart had been broken by the sport. I underwent a surgery that required me to be out of the sport, 2 surgeries actually, that required me to be out of the sport for like 7 or 8 months total. I like my fitness completely went down to zero. I was joking with my high school coach, like I have never in my adult life been in this bad of shape. And that was probably like only 4 or 5 months again before I ended up running faster than I ever had. Yet it felt so far away. And I think I needed my sense of what my status quo was to get completely shattered in order for me to kind of rebuild myself up in a healthier way. And so I would say that there are some tangible benefits. I mean, if you want to run really, really fast, unplanned breaks usually don't contribute to performance. But a planned break where you take a step away from the sport and you intentionally work on other things, for me, that was, again, going through this injury process, really reflecting on how I was approaching the sport. It was starting to work a job. Like, it brought me back to the sport with a totally different lens on how I wanted to approach it. And I think that ultimately led to me enjoying it. It allowed me to pursue it in a way that was compatible with the other things I wanted to do in my life. And ultimately, I think I'm happier because of it. So couldn't agree more.
Alex, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, be the interviewer for a second, and then share some of your biggest learnings and insights from this year. And as always, thank you for the continued blessing you are to me in this community, and my success is your success. So I feel like 2024 was a good one, but we're scratching the surface. So really excited. I even just like smile on my face popped up as I thought about that. Really excited to see what's to come in the coming years. And I think year over year, every time, honestly, probably every few months we talk on the phone, I think I have this realization, and I'll say, I was like, oh my gosh, like I become aware of what I'm saying. And then I go back to that version of myself early on in high school when we first met and started talking, when none of this was even a reality. So this is truly the journey of a lifetime. It's been so much fun. And Can't wait to hear your voice over the airwaves of the Running Effect podcast many, many more times in 2025, as well as to continue to follow along your success in every facet of life that you do, as you've continued to illustrate throughout the years.
Thank you. No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you to everyone who listened towards the end here. And I will just say Happy New Year to those who are listening, probably in early January. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you.